New Year's Eve, 1994, Grozny. The air is thick with a greasy fog of burning diesel and pulverized concrete. Inside a Russian T-8 tank, the heat is stifling. A young conscript stares through a periscope at the skeletal remains of the presidential palace. Silence reigns for a heartbeat, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of a heavy machine gun somewhere in the distance. Then, the radio crackles. A panicked voice screams, "They're everywhere. They're in the basements. They're on the roofs. We're burning." Suddenly, a rocket-propelled grenade slams into the lead vehicle of the Maikop Brigade. The column is trapped. High-rise buildings erupt in a symphony of muzzle flashes. This is the Grozny meat grinder, where a superpower is dismantled by rebels. General Pavel Grashev had promised the Kremlin he could take the city in 2 hours. Instead, he has sent an entire generation into a furnace. As Russian tanks find their turrets unable to elevate high enough to hit snipers, a grim reality sets in. The Soviet war machine did not die in 1991. It is dying here, in the rubble of a city that refuses to kneel. The question that will haunt the Kremlin for decades begins here. How did a tiny mountainous republic, no larger than Connecticut, bring a nuclear-armed giant to its knees? Shadows of the war, the Chechen Wars. Russia's brutal fight for control, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a single event, but a series of tectonic shifts that left the Eurasian landmass fractured. By 1991, the red flag had been lowered over the Kremlin, but the borders of the new Russian Federation remained porous and ill-defined. While the world watched the peaceful transition in Moscow, the North Caucasus was simmering. Chechnya, a region defined by centuries of resistance, saw its opening. Led by Dzhokhar Dudayev, a former Soviet Air Force general, Chechnya declared independence. Moscow, under Boris Yeltsin, was a state in freefall. The economy was a hollowed-out shell, and the military was a shadow of its former self. Soldiers were unpaid, equipment was rusting, and the chain of command was eroded by corruption. Yet Yeltsin could not allow Chechnya to leave. If one republic successfully seceded, the entire Russian Federation might unravel like a loose sweater. Geopolitically, the stakes were even higher. Chechnya sat atop vital oil pipelines and acted as a gateway to the Caspian Sea. To lose Chechnya was to lose the Caucasus. By late 1994, diplomacy had failed. Yeltsin, pressured by hardliners, signed the order to invade, desperate for a small, victorious war. To understand the carnage that followed, one must understand the two men at the center of the storm. Boris Yeltsin was a man of populist fire and deep tragic flaws. He was a leader who had stood on a tank to save Russian democracy in 1991. But by 1994, he was increasingly isolated, battling alcoholism and a paranoid inner circle. Yeltsin viewed the Chechen problem as a minor domestic insurrection, a smudge on the map to be wiped away by a quick show of force. He underestimated the psychological weight of Chechen history, a history of mass deportations under Stalin, and a warrior culture that viewed death in battle as the highest honor. Opposing him was Dzhokhar Dudayev. Dudayev was the ultimate paradox, a man who had reached the highest levels of the Soviet military establishment, yet remained a fierce Chechen nationalist. He knew exactly how the Russian military thought because he had been part of it. He understood their doctrines, their logistical weaknesses, and their reliance on heavy armor. Dudayev wasn't just fighting for a border. He was fighting for 1,000 years of perceived grievances. He transformed Grozny from a provincial capital into a fortress. He utilized the city's dense Soviet architecture to negate Russia's technological edge. The Russian military mobilization was a masterpiece of incompetence. Units were cobbled together from different districts. Many soldiers met their officers for the first time on the train to the border. Communication equipment didn't work, or worse, utilized unencrypted civilian frequencies that the Chechens highly monitored. The plan was a three-pronged assault on Grozny, moving with the speed of a blitzkrieg, but the geography of the Caucasus is a nightmare for an invader. The Russian high command relied on outdated maps and intelligence reports that suggested that Chechens would flee at the sight of Russian colors. They ignored the fact that the Chechens were armed with the same modern weaponry the Russians used: AK-74s, RPG-7 South, and manpads often purchased from corrupt Russian officers. The deception was complete. Dudayev allowed the Russian columns to advance deep into the city center before springing the trap. December 31st, 1994. The New Year's Eve assault began with a deafening artillery barrage, but as the 131st Maikop Brigade rolled into Grozny, they found an eerie silence. There were no roadblocks, no barricades. They reached the central railway station by midday, believing they had one. Then, the world exploded. The Chechens had organized into small, highly mobile hunter-killer teams, armed with multiple RPGs. They targeted the first and last vehicles in the Russian columns, effectively corking the streets. Russian tanks, designed for the open plains of Europe, found themselves trapped in narrow corridors. Chechen fighters fired from third-story windows and basement grates, areas where tank cannons could not depress or elevate to reach them. The Russian infantry, mostly untrained conscripts, refused to leave the safety of their armored personnel carriers, turning their vehicles into steel coffins. Communication broke down instantly. Different Russian units began firing on each other in the confusion. By midnight, the railway station was a slaughterhouse. The Maikop Brigade was being systematically erased. Of the 26 tanks that entered the city center, 20 were destroyed. Of the 120 armored vehicles, 102 were lost. The brigade commander, Colonel Ivan Savin, desperately radioed for reinforcements that never came. His final messages were punctuated by the sound of gunfire closing in. By the time the sun rose in 1995, the 131st Brigade had effectively ceased to exist, its remnants scattered and dying in the ruins. The psychological shift on the battlefield was seismic. The Russian soldier, told he was a liberator, realized he was an intruder in a land that hated him. The Chechens, meanwhile, gained the confidence of those who have stared down a giant and seen it bleed. The aftermath of the First Chechen War was a humiliation Russia had not felt since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Official casualty figures were suppressed, but estimates suggest nearly 6,000 Russian soldiers died, with tens of thousands of Chechen civilians caught in the crossfire. The Khasavyurt Accord of 1996 granted Chechnya de facto independence, but it was a peace built on sand. Grozny was a wasteland, the economy was dead, and the vacuum of power was quickly filled by radicalized factions. The fallout in Moscow was equally severe. Yeltsin's presidency never recovered, the military was demoralized, the budget was bankrupt, and the Russian public's trust in the state was shattered. However, out of this chaos, a new figure began to rise through the ranks of the FSB, a man who watched the humiliation of the First War with cold, calculating fury. His name was Vladimir Putin. The First Chechen War failed because of a singular catastrophic strategic miscalculation, the belief that firepower could replace urban warfare training. The Russian leadership fell victim to the mirror image fallacy, assuming the Chechens would fight like a conventional army. They sent heavy armor into a labyrinth without infantry support. They prioritized political deadlines, specifically New Year's Day, over tactical readiness. This overconfidence led to the destruction of the Maikop Brigade in a protracted conflict that would eventually see the entire city of Grozny leveled by indiscriminate carpet bombing, a tactic born of frustration rather than strategy. But the story did not end with the Khasavyurt Accord. By 1999, the peace evaporated. An invasion of neighboring Dagestan by Chechen-based militants and a series of apartment bombings in Russian cities provided the pretext for the Second Chechen War. This time, the Russian approach was different. The era of the small, victorious war was over. This was a war of annihilation. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, the Russian military abandoned the surgical approach for scorched earth. Grozny was declared by the UN to be the most destroyed city on earth. The Russian military utilized filtration camps to weed out insurgents, leading to widespread reports of human rights abuses. The war shifted from a conventional conflict to a brutal counter-insurgency eventually. The Kremlin found a local ally, Akhmat Kadyrov, a former rebel who defected to the Russian side. This Chechenization of the conflict allowed Moscow to withdraw its regular troops while a brutal internal war was waged between pro-Russian Chechens and the remaining separatists. The legacy of the Chechen Wars is written in the DNA of modern warfare. It was here that Russia perfected the use of hybrid warfare, a combination of overwhelming conventional force, psychological operations, and the use of local proxies. The tactics developed in the ruins of Grozny would later be seen in Aleppo and Mariupol. The wars also marked the end of the post-Cold War dream of a Western-aligned Russia. They fueled a resurgent Russian nationalism and provided the crucible in which the current Russian leadership was forged. It was a conflict that taught the Kremlin that the world might condemn brutality, but it rarely stops it. Today, Grozny is a city of gleaming skyscrapers and wide boulevards, rebuilt with billions of rubles from Moscow. It is governed by Ramzan Kadyrov, who rules with an iron fist and absolute loyalty to Putin. But beneath the polished marble and the neon lights, the ghosts of the 1990s remain. The silence of the North Caucasus is not the silence of peace, but the silence of an unresolved history. The Chechen Wars proved that while you can bury a rebellion under enough concrete and steel, the scars of a brutal fight for control never truly fade. They simply wait for the next tremor in the earth to reopen. The black fog of 1994 has lifted, but the shadows it casts still stretch across the world. A haunting reminder that in the theater of war, the most expensive victory is often indistinguishable from defeat.